Okay, so I thought I said I would spend 10 minutes to finish up this lecture and talk about this very interesting problem of why there are so many trees. So way back in 1913, Gauss introduced this idea of the competitive exclusion principle, which states that if two species use the same resources in the same place at the same time in the same way, they should fail to coexist because one should outcompete the other. And if that's the case, then how is diversity maintained? And this has been a conundrum of ecologists for a long time. And with plants, it becomes acute because, well, plants fundamentally compete for light, water, and a limited set of nutrients. And so one hypothesis has always been that there's fine-scale resource partitioning for access to micronutrients or nitrogen or light. Second hypothesis is that competition isn't the driving force, that there's some top-down control by predators that drives survival and limits the capacity for competitive exclusion. They're being controlled by a different trophic level. And the third hypothesis that you have to entertain is that species that may be competitive equivalents might take a long time to exclude one another. And that if it does take a long time to drive populations to extinction, and there are periodic disturbances that reset the clock, then for competition, then might be difficult to drive species towards extinction. And in the pre-lecture, I mentioned that there's evidence now that extinction rates in tropical systems are lower than in temperate regions, and so we think that there hasn't been all that much competition. So species ought to partition their environment very finely, or there ought to be niche axes we don't understand that are making it more capable for things to happen, or we should have strong top-down control, or systems could be in non-equilibrium states, such as the third hypothesis, or diversity should be low. And we know that in some cases diversity is not low. So here's an informal history of trying to understand this problem. That I'd say before 1980 that forests were dominated by temperate forest paradigms, and that people thinking about species replacement and thinking about trees as being shade tolerant or shade intolerant. And this whole question of how you maintain diversity didn't really come up because diversity just wasn't that high in those temperate forests. In the 1980s and 90s, we have this tropical enlightenment and flourishing of this question, and recognition of really deep, broad diversity. And with all this diversity, the first thought was there must be fine partitioning. And people thought of things like a light niche or a regeneration niche. There are some other things in there that I'll talk about briefly that also think about top-down control by predators or pathogens. And then in the 1990s, 2000s, you have Hubble's neutral theory. If we can't distinguish species niches, maybe all species are really sort of ecological equivalents, and what would we expect then? And so this made a big splash. Steve Hubble studied trees in Barrow, Colorado Island, and proposed this and suggested that it actually works reasonably well for neotropical forests. And then more recently, we've had these phylogenetic hypotheses, thinking about relatedness and that idea of relatedness in competition, and asking whether trees that you find in a community or plant or species that you find together in a community are phylogenetically overdispersed, and therefore avoiding competition, or whether they're near relatives, so they overdispersion and near relatives avoid each other, or whether some phylogenetic clustering occurs, and in which case they're being selected by the environment. So I'm going to go through a little bit of evidence for each of those things. But P.J. Grubb in 1976 published a paper called "The Importance of the Regeneration Niche," and before you had sort of a habitat niche and a life form niche and a phenological niche, sort of where plants live and what they do. But this regeneration niche was some combination of where they live and what they do, and it launched this massive hunt for this holy grail of fine-scale partitioning of shade tolerance. So there are a whole bunch of papers from the tropics on gap phase regeneration, Brokaw, Clark's, Hubble, and Foster, all looking at these things, and really couldn't find very many flavors of light tolerance. Again, we seem to have things that were really shade tolerant and a few things that were really not shade tolerant, and a few things that were sort of in between, but that couldn't really possibly explain the variation. And people like Katayama, she looked at this with respect to photosynthetic response rates in physiological trials. Again, no good way to really partition this environment out. And so people have been thinking about that question for a long time. As you see, the dates of those papers come up into 2000. The Janzen-Connell hypothesis suggests this idea that there's some optimal distance away from a parent tree that works best. That if you think about the seed rain, the further away from a parent tree, the lower the density of seeds. But that they also argued that pathogens build up with and insect pests build up under trees and on trees, such that the probability of a seedling surviving goes up as you move further and further away from that parent tree, and that there may be some sweet spot in between where there's sufficient seed rain and sufficient survival rate that sort of maximizes survivorship and population performance. And people have looked for this and found components of this hypothesis to be well supported in terms of seedling survivorship going up as a function of distance away from the parent tree. And we know that seed rain declines as a function of distance. So Hubble proposed in a Princeton monograph this null hypothesis for ecology. For species at the same trophic level competing, assume that the demographic rates and responses to the environment are all drawn from the same random pool, and it predicts a null distribution of abundance and predicts a null distribution of a species-area relationship, and it suggests that it fits reasonably well, and that this could explain the diversity that we have in tropical forests. And but people have a hard time swallowing this idea that trees all have more or less the same demographic rates. We can tell they differ in their seed production. We can tell they differ in their, and sometimes in their photosynthetic response rates, although not finely. And we can tell that they have different growth rates, and they respond to environmental perturbations differently. So we think that this, but the onus then, as Hubble put it, is on people trying to disprove that null hypothesis. And so this idea in terms of the null hypothesis for ecology is that non-equilibrium dynamics would in fact dominate, and that it would take a long time in the tropics for extinction to occur. And so I must say there's been no definitive answer out of that pool either. So from a different angle, people started thinking about communities as a collection of species drawn from a regional pool of species, and that maybe closely related species are less likely to coexist because they compete more closely with close relatives. But maybe closely related species are more likely to coexist because they share niche space and niche traits, and therefore they would use the same kinds of resources. So there's an example that Gene Cavan-Roberts did famously with these 25 or so oaks that are in northern Florida and 10 hickories, and asking which ones aggregate into which kinds of oak hickory forests, oaks that are more closely related to other oaks or oaks that are less closely related to other oaks. And the way this works is to think about it this way in cartoons. This is from that Cavan-Roberts paper, is that you have these communities and that you can map these things onto phylogenies, and these circles represent communities, and you might have trees or species that are all from the same part of that phylogeny, and that would be phylogenetic clustering. That's the upper left diagram. Or you might have phylogenetic overdispersion, where communities were collecting species from different parts of that clade. You can also think of that with respect to traits, that traits can be conserved, and that you might have species in neighborhoods on those phylogenies having the same kinds of traits, or there could be trait convergence, and that species in the same habitats that share the same habitats may converge in their traits across these phylogenies. Now, of course, and then you can also then compare those traits to those communities or niches, and what you'd find you could find some sort of phenotypic clustering where species share the same traits and the same community, and that they're all close in with one another. Or you could find just the opposite, where the traits are conserved in some kind of community, but that it represents communities across a variety of different portions of the phylogeny. So Cam Webb did this. That's a stick insect on Cam Webb's neck there, by the way, and looking for clustering of traits and versus overdispersion of traits, and then whether the trait evolution is conserved or convergent, and you'd either get some kind of phylogenetic overdispersion in the upper right or lower left, and you'd get some sort of phylogenetic clustering at the upper left, or possibly random distribution down in the lower right. And so they invented these metrics, one called the net relatedness index, which reflects the degree to which the phylogeny of an assemblage of trees is clumped, and the nearest taxa index, which is a distance from the closest relative for each member of the pool, as measures of moving along that phylogeny. Well, there have been several people who have tried this idea out, and in Borneo, this is where Cam Webb worked, the NRI, not different from the null, but the NTI, so the nearest taxa index, was significantly greater than expected, so there was some kind of clustering there. Did not find any pattern in Costa Rica, some overdispersion in savannas in Brazil, some clustering in semi-deciduous deciduous woodlands, and some kind of mixed effect in Amazonian rainforest. So the result is that there are lots and lots of different hypotheses out there for why we might get all these species coexisting, but frankly, it's been a conundrum that's been very difficult for ecologists to sort out. And like many ecological hypotheses, there might be multiple competing hypotheses, or multiple hypotheses that aren't mutually exclusive, and so operating simultaneously. The result is that our understanding of this remains just a complete mess. There's lots of drivers, all which may play a role. There's historical biogeography, pathogens, pests, competition, disequilibrium, niche partitioning. These are all things that may help maintain diversity in these hyperdiverse tropical forests. Okay, great, thanks, and that's done, and see you on Tuesday. Having trouble finishing this, so we'll see how whenever. Oh wait, this.